Thank you, Chris. That was absolutely beautiful and perfect. Perfect for today's talk. So grateful for our really talented members of this of our music team. So, welcome again, those are on Zoom and those who are watching the live stream. We're continuing today with our series on revolutionary love based on the book See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love by Valerie Kaur. Now, the author shares her personal story and shares her life experiences and responses within her spiritual perspective, which is very closely aligned with Unity teachings. To briefly review, the book is a memoir of her personal journey as a Sikh woman born in California, experiencing and chronicling the persecution and hate crimes against all those deemed as other following September 11th. Her response is a manifesto outlined in practical spiritual terms that offers revolutionary love as a way to heal and transform all of us. Now, revolutionary love is not a new idea. It has informed and empowered social transformation movements throughout history, like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. And it's grounded in the spiritual teachings of justice, peace, compassion, and love. Now, Kaur describes revolutionary love as an ethic, not an emotion. That is an orientation to life that is personal, rooted in joy, and is a force for justice that can only be practiced in community. The book's divided into three parts, each offering three practices that teach and support us in becoming agents of revolutionary love. The first part was titled See No Stranger, and that involves learning to love others and recognizing that a stranger is simply a part of ourselves we do not yet know. It involves being willing to wonder about strangers and others, being willing to grieve with them, and choose to fight and for them. The second part, which we began last week and will complete today, is titled Tend the Wounds. This involves learning to love our opponents. And there are three practices, and they include rage, meaning we must first heal ourselves and our rage so that we may listen and learn to love others. The second is listen, and that's being willing to wonder about and listen to our opponent's perspectives. And then there's reimagine, and that is we use a broadened perspective and understanding to envision and co-create a new world, one that is grounded in the principles of revolutionary love. Now, the third and final part is breathe and push. And that's about learning to love ourselves. And the three practices for that are breathe, push, and transition. And we'll cover those as the series continues. Last week, we looked at the practice of what Kaur calls rage. It's the process of acknowledging and tending to our own wounds so that we can more effectively see no stranger. And we apply this to our opponents. See no stranger with our opponents. It moves us from Jesus's teaching on loving our neighbors as ourselves into loving our enemies as ourselves. Now, we know that there can be no enemies because there is only love and truth. But in our worldly experience, in the world of duality, we see us versus them. So we can perceive that something or someone is an enemy. Now, through her own experiences of abuse, she discovered that the path to healing required her to acknowledge and process her own righteous rage within a safe container, which for her was energy-based body work. By directly addressing the traumas that she had stored in her body, she was able to create a new narrative, a new story. And by doing that, she was able to reclaim her sense of self-worth, and her personal agency without harming herself or others. It also allowed her to redirect the energy into a life-giving expression rather than a destructive one. It was like being able to wonder once again with others, including those that had hurt her. And that brings us to the second practice in Tend the Wounds. And that's today we're covering listen. The author wrote, there comes a point in the aftermath of cruelty or injury when I start to wonder about my opponent. Why did they do that, say that, believe that? What is at stake for them? What is driving their behavior? She explains that she learned that we don't need to feel anything for our opponents in order to practice love. Love is a labor that returns us to wonder. It's seeing another person's humanity, even if they deny our own. We just have to choose to wonder about them. Now, this is similar to our teaching and practice about forgiveness. Forgiveness is something we do for ourselves, not for the other person. It frees us. And that's what listening is. It frees us to move back into wonder. It moves us to seeing them as human beings just like us. Now, she quotes Toni Morrison, who said, I refuse to let anyone belittle my soul or diminish my own expansive sense of self. The more I listen, the less I hate. The less I hate, the more I am free to choose actions that are controlled not by animosity, but by wisdom. Laboring to love my opponents is how I love myself. This is not the stuff of saintliness. This is our birthright. Listening is a strategic choice. The more we listen, the more we understand. We realize that there is no such thing as monsters in the world, only human beings who are wounded. Now, understanding the why to listen, the author moves to how to listen, which begins with what she calls the art of listening to stories. She says debating policies keep us stuck in our existing arguments, but sharing our stories can break through the barriers of belief and assumptions that we carry, giving us a glimpse into a different reality from our own. Stories engage us. And when we're listening to someone's story, we're not thinking about a response. So we tend to listen deeper. And this deeper listening is an act of surrender because we may possibly have changed our minds about what we hear. And we might also be changed by what we hear. Now, deep listening is a skill. It begins with leaving our preconceptions at the door, quieting the thoughts within our mind, and engaging with all our senses. The most critical part of listening is trying to understand what really matters to the other person, rather than what we think matters. This means listening to what is said, not what we expect to hear. But listening to another is only part of the process. Listening is only effective when it leads to action, which requires a willingness to engage in the discomfort and dwell in the hard truths. Because the purpose of listening across the lines of difference is not an agreement or a compromise or fleeting feel-good moments, it's an understanding. And true understanding is impossible unless we risk changing our worldview. What would it be like to understand someone that we consider an opponent? What would it be like to have our perception shift? Not saying that they're right, not saying that they're wrong, but just understanding. Understanding shifts everything. Now, Kaur engaged in a national tour of college campuses showing her film about the Sikh persecution after 9/11. Not wanting to alienate her audiences, she kept finding ways to talk about hate crimes without naming white supremacy. But she realized that there could be no reconciliations without truth. As difficult as it was, it had to be named. After one of her presentations, she went to a Mexican restaurant with some of her colleagues. And she shares a story about an impromptu conversation she had with a group of older white men. And this was sparked by her ability to practice wonder. These men were drinking beers, they were rowdy, their voices were booming through the restaurant, and their conversation was laced with racist expletives. She approached them and said, "Excuse me." And immediately one of them cut her off sarcastically and said, "What, did we say something racist?" She calmly said, "You see, people in my community have been beaten and killed hearing those words." This conversation went on for some time. It's explained in great detail in the book, but it's really too long for me to share the whole thing. But it was a very long conversation. And in the end, she thanked them for listening, and they all left except one. He defended himself by saying, "My wife is Mexican," and that he listened to jazz. So in his mind, he was proving that he wasn't a racist. And then, with using the euphemisms, the racial slurs, and the expletives, he proceeded to berate people of color and ultimately say that they were subhuman and had no right to live. Needless to say, Carr was stunned, taken aback, but she managed to say goodbye and shook his hand when he left. Very upset, she sat down and thought and realized that she had walked over to their table thinking that she could make a difference, and she ended up shaken up and frightened. So the question became, how do we learn to effectively listen to others whose beliefs we find disgusting or enraging or terrifying? When their words seem dangerous, it creates an invisible wall between them and us. She says it's important to remember the goal of listening is not to feel empathy for our opponents or validate their ideas or even change their mind. Our goal is to understand them. And that's the key. Our goal is to understand, not to make right, not to judge, but to understand. And I've said this before in other talks. No one is born a racist. No one is born with hate. Those are learned behaviors. And it's by understanding the cultural forces that have shaped that belief and the institutions that embolden people to act on it that aid in change. In truth, in order to create a safer world for all of us, we must not only resist or defeat such opponents, we must invite them into transformation as we are invited to transform. And that requires finding ways to overcome our own emotional resistance and choose to ask questions about them. Not an easy task. Neuroscientists call this cognitive load. That's trying to understand the perspective and pain of people we are inclined to hate. And it's challenging. It's a challenging cognitive change. The load only lightens with practice and gets easier as we practice self-compassion and have the support of a community that is grounded in the amazing healing power of love. Carr says, when listening gets hard, she focuses on taking the next breath and pays attention to sensations in her body. Heat, cleansing, clenching, constriction. She feels the ground beneath her feet and asks herself, am I safe? If she feels safe, she stays, she slows her breath, quiets her mind, and releases the pressure that pushes her to defend her position, trying instead to wonder about the person's story and the possible wounds in them that have added or created that story. Reflecting back on the men in the restaurant, she wondered what more she could have done, what more she could have learned if she had stayed longer, if she had listened longer. She wrote down their words and kept listening to their voices in her mind until she was able to quiet her reaction of disgust. And then it happened. She heard the suffering inside their hate. These men inhabited a world filled not with people, but with subhumans who threatened them. What a painful way to live. So she saw past the words and heard their suffering and their fear and was able to relate to them on that level. Even though their pain didn't justify their hate, she could listen from inside their pain. She no longer saw white nationalists as simple or evil. Instead, she saw them as deeply human, deeply complex, and deeply wounded. But she also realized that this did not make them less dangerous. The bottom line, the goal is to stay curious long enough to be changed by what we hear. And maybe our opponents will begin to wonder about us in return, ask us questions, listen to our story. Maybe their views will expand, or maybe they won't. Really doesn't matter as long as the primary goal of listening is to deepen our own understanding, expand our own hearts, and release ourselves from the toxicity of hate. Listening doesn't grant the other side legitimacy. It grants them humanity and preserves our own. It's only from a space of shared humanity that we can shift our focus from resistance to reimagining a world as it could be, dedicated to justice and a world that works for all. Now, on a side note, we were taught in ministerial school that part of our job was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Now, I always get a chuckle when I hear that and when we talk about it in our minister meetings. You know, there is truth to it because we're on this earth plane to learn, to grow, and evolve. We're here to raise our consciousness, and we need to be brutally honest. It's only by looking at the unpleasant and by being in pain that we find the motivation to learn and grow. So we need to be brutally honest about what's going on in the world, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of understanding that there are so many people who are wounded and act out in pain. It doesn't make it right, but it allows us to live from a place of revolutionary love. You know, the fifth unity principle is the practical application of truth principles in the world. It's about walking our walk, living our truth, and being the light, love, peace, and oneness to the best of our ability. The manifest world is our classroom, reflecting back to us our consciousness, revealing where we still need to grow so that we will ultimately see no stranger and love one another, even our enemies. And that's what Jesus taught, to love one another as you love yourself. So I invite you now to get comfortable in your seats as we move into meditation. So just close your eyes and sit back in your seat. Put your feet firmly on the floor and just allow yourselves to breathe. And as you breathe in, you feel all the stress and strain leave your body. You feel all your cares and concerns leave with every breath. Because with each inhalation, you feel the peace and love and divinity that you are. It is only within the world of duality that we can see separateness, that we can see differences. And it is our joy and our privilege to rise above that, to see that there is no stranger. There is only a part of ourself that we do not yet know. Many times we see people in pain, acting from fear, from being misguided, from not understanding truth, from seeing separateness, from seeing them versus us, and feeling threatened that their way is being changed. We harness the power of listening, the power of compassion, the power of love that's within each and every one of us, so that we can be present and open to loving all, even those who may harm us. We know that there is only one and that we are guided and protected in all that we do. And we know that by listening, by truly listening, we are opening an avenue to understand. Understanding is one of the 12 powers. And all of these powers lie within us that we can call upon at any moment. And we also understand that just as our opponent may be expressing from woundedness and pain, before we can open up and accept and love them, we need to deal with our own wounds, our own pain. So right now we bring to mind anything that may be standing in our way from truly loving every human, regardless of race, regardless of belief, regardless of political affiliation. All of that is removed, and we only see another expression of God, the Christ, before us. So as we move deeper and deeper into the silence, we allow the Holy Spirit to remove from us anything that may be standing in our way of truly loving all, including strangers. And now I bring to mind anyone who may be in need of prayer. And that includes everyone on our prayer list on Silent Unity and to all of humanity. We know that there's a power and a presence within them that will see them through any difficulty they are experiencing. We know that anything that is occurring to anyone right now is there for their highest good. And we affirm the Christ in them will see them through anything. And now I invite you to bring your consciousness back into the room where you are, back into your body. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Welcome back.